But
And
for me, it was the joy of doing that with my friends. That's where.
Oh yeah, that was great. That was a good.
But you guys are walking in Darwin's footsteps.
Yeah.
Darwin didn't understand the significance of Darwin's finches. He gave them to John Gould because they were so confusing. He's like, I can't deal with this.
Everybody thinks he had this eureka moment, right? But he didn't understand the finches until he understand evolution, until he understood natural selection.
Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. That was a little preview from this week's episode with Kevin Burns on Darwin's finches. Kevin and Shannon's research reclassified Darwin's finches as tanagers, so we hear all about what that process was like and learn more about Darwin's finches on this week's episode. So let's grab our binoculars and get into it. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. And Kevin, thanks for joining us again. So last week we talked about tanagers, and we're talking about more tanagers this week. And it's tanagers that I think not everybody realizes are tanagers. It's Darwin's finches. Maybe more people realize than Amanda and I realized. But...
No, you're right. It's one of the biggest surprises that we found working on tanagers. And, we first published this result in early 2000, and you can still open up textbooks even, and they don't kind of recognize this fact. And so it was pretty unexpected when we started working on it. And but it was cool because then we were able to put this huge classic example of adaptive radiation kind of in its context, if you will, once we knew where they came from and who they came from.
But because that part of the tree was so messed up, especially at the time, we did not have a direction of what happened when we put the sequences together to make a tree. Like I remember looking at my computer. We put it on over the weekend. Kevin was working on tanagers. We had another friend who was working on birds in the Caribbean, and John and I had recently gotten to the Field Museum where we had a bunch of other Caribbean birds and other bird sequences. And were you the one who said we should put it in a matrix, Kevin? I don't even remember how that happened.
Yeah. And so, Shannon was involved in the study as well as our friend Nedra Klein, who's no longer with us. And Nedra had a sequence of banana quit, which is a widespread bird found throughout the Caribbean and South America. And it has it's a nectar feeding bird with this little decurved bill. So it doesn't look anything like a Darwin's finch. And I came up in my tree. This is back when I was first working on tanagers. And every time I got a new sequence, I'd run it and see what we get. And it came up my tree next to one of the grass quits from the Caribbean or something with this finch-shaped bill. And I thought, well, that's really weird. This must be a mistake. And I went down to the collection. I was working at the American Museum at the time. And that's one of the great things about museums. You can go down and look and see what's there. And then I noticed there's all these banana quits that there's a dark morph banana quit that's like almost solid black. And I was like, you know what? That almost looks like one of these finches and even a Darwin's finch, but it's got a different kind of beak on its face, And then it kind of went from there. There were other studies that sort of suggested maybe connections between some of these other Caribbean finches, but there wasn't really any solid evidence of that.
But we should talk a little bit about Galapagos finches in terms of because they always bug me with the word radiation in certain ways, because I tend to think people underappreciate sort of what the Geospizinae is. It's a subfamily right now.
No, it's not.
It's not even a subfamily.
It's a subfamily because it's not monophyletic with respect to the birds that we found that were closely related to it. So it's in the subfamily Cerebrinae with the Darwin's finches, which we call them Darwin's finches because there's that one from Cocos Island that's not on the Galapagos. And then, within that larger groups, they're embedded within there. So they can't be a separate subfamily. They have to be within that one because they're not related to those other birds. They're part of that radiation.
I think there's a lot of things we still don't know about Darwin's finches. One of the most studied groups of birds, at least by just a couple of research groups for decades. Some of the most elegant studies on natural selection have been done on Darwin's finches, but I think we still underestimate the power of the tree of life to tell us something about Darwin's finches. And I think we underestimate how many species there might be, or overestimate how many species there might be, depending on your species designation. They're really complicated.
The classification on eBird, which is the Clements list, has 18 species now currently. But maybe we should just talk a little bit about the different types of beaks and the different diets before we get further into this.
Sure.
So what makes in this classic example is all the different beak shapes. There's some with really large beaks or bills that are used for cracking large seeds, and some have smaller bills that are better for smaller seeds. There's some with like a little warbler type bill for like picking things off of substrates. There's the cactus finch that thrives on cactus and nests in cactus. There's the vegetarian finch that will eat like leaves and flower buds, which is really weird for a bird to do. Then there's the woodpecker finch. There's no woodpeckers on the Galapagos, so the woodpecker will take like a cactus spine or will sharpen a twig and then use that to probe into bark and get out grubs.
Whoa.
So it's filled that niche through like a behavioral adaptation.
There's a vampire finch.
Which we
that's where I'm going next. The vampire finch. Want to talk about that one?
we talked. We have
Really
a podcast episode on vampire finch
Oh, you
Yeah.
did. I missed that one.
related
Yeah.
to a bloodsuckers exhibition that just left the Field Museum, actually. So
Nice.
yeah,
Nice.
yeah. So
So the vampire finch. So yeah, that's just and it all happened in a really short amount of time. When the earlier episode, I said that the tanagers are an order of magnitude, the radiation, the rate of diversification or speciation compared to other vertebrates. But when I did an analysis of diversification across all tanagers, the Darwin's finches were way above even that. So they really do stand out as extreme, even among the tanagers, which are already pretty extreme.
So are the Darwin's finches just found in the Galapagos only then? So all of the speciation happened within the Galapagos, or?
There's one on Cocos Island, which is kind of between the Galapagos and Central America.
Okay. Wow.
So it's called the Cocos Island finch.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's interestingly enough got a bill that is kind of halfway between seed eating and insect eating, and it actually does a little bit of both. And part of that may be because it's the only finch on the island, and it's got no competition from anything else.
So what we know about Darwin's finches, their beak evolution in general, is that they can change. The islands can change sizes, average sizes of beaks of some of these birds over very short periods of ecological time, not even evolutionary time. So in environments that are this variable, which the Galapagos certainly are, the prevailing weathers can change pretty dramatically, and that can both promote certain beaks to get birds that have them to be bigger populations, and then it can crash them too. So if you're a little beaked bird on an island that all of a sudden has a bunch of big seeds and not very many little seeds, your population will dwindle, if not go extinct. And the same is true if it's got a bunch of small seeds. The big-billed birds can't manipulate seeds very well. And so there's an advantage to having a little beak at that point. So those dynamics have played themselves out over relatively short periods of time. Kevin, you should talk about how old Darwin's finches are themselves.
Yeah, that I just to touch on what you said. Yeah, the Grants, Rosemary and Peter Grant, were kind of the ones to really show that natural selection, evidence of that in the field, in nature, not just in the lab or something like that, or not just digging up in fossils, but natural selection, evolution happening in a short amount of time, people can witness with the Darwin's finches. So that was pretty important. In terms of how old they are, they're to their closest relative. I think it's like if you look back to that branching point, it's about 2.5 million years, I think, something like that. But then it's hard to say, they're probably younger than that as well. So that's not very much time. Most species of birds are about 2 million. One species would be about 2 million years to its sister species, typically in birds anyway. And so for all of that to happen in that short amount of time is pretty crazy.
And at the same time, I want to point out that when I think of the adaptive radiation in the Galapagos, the things that is most interesting for me is that the ancestor of Darwin's finch, no matter what it looked like, got there and has produced something that's basically foraging on insects all the time versus something that's foraging on seeds all the time. And those lineages have actually spread across the Galapagos Islands, and they've done it in actually different ways. So whereas you get communities of the seed-eating birds on a given island, a given island will only have basically one taxon of the insect-eating warbler finch. And I think that's an important and underappreciated aspect of the comparative evolution, but it's a really neat part of the adaptive radiation of Galapagos finches, that they were able to do that.
The most bizarre thing for me was finding, first off, that Darwin's finches were that closely related to each other. There was that little genetic diversity amongst that little genetic differentiation among things. It didn't track with the things I thought. But then outside of that was what their closest living relatives are, which are not at all what people thought, because tanagers are so crazy and they've explored so much of plumage morphology and beak morphology space. The things that Darwin's finches are related to were not intuitive to me at all. I don't know if you thought about that very much, Kevin, before that tree came out of our computers in the way back world.
Well, certainly not in the way it came out. I mean, there'd been a lot of speculation about what they were related to, and there were birds kind of all over the tanager tree. And so what we got was a surprise. And I think there's three kind of cool facts that came out of that surprise. So what we found was that the birds that were related to the Darwin's finches also varied a lot in beak size and shape. So some of them had seed-eating bills, some of them have nectar-feeding bills like the banana quid. And so they have this whole diversity of beak shape. And so that evolution of beak diversity was happening in that group before they even got to the Galapagos. And the second really interesting thing that we found is that most of those birds are found on islands in the Caribbean. And a lot of them are endemic on different islands in the Caribbean. And there are a couple in South America that are that live in South America, but most of them can be found on the Caribbean. And so kind of the standard story before was that one of these birds, a dull-colored grassquit, came over to the Galapagos and speciated into all these different birds. So kind of a couple problems with that scenario. One is that you don't have a living species usually as the ancestor of something else. That'd be like saying chimpanzees are the ancestor to humans or something, which is not the case. They've both been evolving the same amount of time. And the dull-colored grassquit was, I think, used a lot because it's from Ecuador, nearby Ecuador, right? Galapagos is part of Ecuador. And also, it's kind of a blank slate. It doesn't have a lot of, it's kind of a medium-sized bill and not a lot of colors on it, so it made sense. But we found dull-colored grassquit in our group, but it's one of many different species in that group. And it clearly is closely related to Darwin's finches, but then there's all these other finches that are in there too. The third fact, and then I'll stop for a second, is that they all make dome-shaped nests. The Darwin's finches and all these birds in the Caribbean and all the ones they're closely related to all make a dome-shaped nest, not like the classic open-cut nest. So all along, their nests were providing a clue to their relationships, their hidden relationships.
Oh, cool.
And that was the fun part of that. Another part of the fun part is that when Kevin was looking at nest biology, and every bird that had that kind of nest, we would get a sequence of, and it would fall in that group. So, the idea that kind of nest was something that documented the relationships, that anything you found that had that nest went in that clade, anything you found that didn't. So, and to me, that was really a fun thing too. Like, what's next? What kind of nest does this thing make? And then, make a guess about where you think it goes. And then it goes there and you're like, holy cow, look at that.
Yeah. And I think you guys should talk a little bit about the scientific process. So once you figure out something like that you think supports an argument that other people haven't made, you start writing a paper. And then when that paper is done, you have to submit it for scientific publication.
How long does that process take?
Oh, in our case, it took several years because
Yeah, it took longer than necessary, I think. In the end, we came in up with a good product and a better product. And I suppose in hindsight, I'm happy the way it worked out. But I think we first started trying to publish that result, I want to say in like 98 or 99.
yeah,
And it kept getting turned down. Um,
because it
so
was heretical. The things we found were heretical to people, and so there was a lot of denialism that we could have found something like that, like this.
So I'm interested in that process once you were denied, like what did you do for your next version to try to make it through? Like, do you personally appeal to the people who read read the papers, or how does it work?
We don't
sometimes you
know.
can.
We don't know
You
who's
go to the
reading them, right?
bar.
You go
I have one journal I submitted it to, and then that after this is by email I submitted it. That afternoon there was a fax. This is back in the days of faxes. There was a fax in my mailbox saying it was not going to be published, and that was the end.
Oh.
I was like, okay. So I was like, all right. But you just it's hard to get something published. It's like I feel like it's like a baseball batting average or something. If you get something in 1 out of 3 times, you're doing good. But you just sort of dust yourself off and try not to take it too personal. And then you sort of weigh the options, like what do the reviews say? Could I possibly get it in here? But more often than not, you just try a different journal, or sometimes the reviewers have really good suggestions. And so you got to keep an open mind, and then you add some of that stuff in and make us somewhere else. In our case, we were able to add more species as time went on. So that I think helped us have a more comprehensive story.
We had to take it away from Darwin's finches a little bit because that invokes a lot of pre-existing knowledge that people bring into the conversation, and we needed it to be seen as a tree of life paper. We weren't saying anything about what happens within Darwin's finches, right? What a species is, none of that. So if you send it to the Darwin's finch people and you tell them, look, you've been studying beak morphology variation without the context, they don't like you. They don't like it. You would just reject things. I've rejected things that go against my worldview, especially about the role that selection might play in things. And so eventually we appealed to the someone who was handling our paper at Evolution, and it got rejected even there, the journal Evolution. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. We're not saying anything. If you took out Darwin's finches and put, I don't know, finch A, B, C, or D, nobody would have a problem with this. It's actually fairly simple. But then when it was treated like a phylogeny paper, like a tree of life paper, then it went to people who were understanding the tree of life and could appreciate it from a different perspective. So it just wasn't all about Darwin's finches at that point. And at that point, it got published.
Yeah, I think thank you for reminding me of that, Shannon, because we did add a whole bunch about, comparing morphological variation, and we added a whole bunch of other so-called tanagers. This is before we had the tanagers sorted out, so we were able to talk about that a little more. But I think the controversial part about it, the part that people kind of had a knee-jerk reaction to, was that we had all these Caribbean species in there. So when we did biogeographic reconstructions, the biogeographic origin became Caribbean as opposed to South America, more than, well, at least equal chance. And so that went against what people had kind of thought in the textbooks or whatever, that had come from South America. But, if you look at the map, the Caribbean is not really that far. Those islands are not that far from the Galapagos, and birds fly, and then look at a map that has not a flat map, but a globe, really. And you can see, South America is actually pretty far east, and the Caribbean's right there. So it is plausible. And there's lots of other studies that have shown a Galapagos Caribbean connection for other animals. So at the time that wasn't the case, but I think that was what a lot of people had a knee-jerk reaction to. But the good part, the kind of the end of the story, I don't know if this is the same for Shannon. Shannon, of course, one of the authors in the paper. It's turned out to be my hardest paper to get published, but it's also my most cited paper.
Oh, nice.
It's the paper that has the most citations, and consistently been that way for years. So I feel like it was worth it in the end.
Yeah.
Although at the time it was a struggle, because I also was talking about scientific process. I was trying to get tenure because I was a new professor in my position, and I spent a lot of energy on that one publication, and I wasn't publishing other papers. So
I guess I learned a lot about the politics of science in the context of that only presaged what I would do after that, which is look at the tree of life of all birds, which is political to, another degree of, I don't know. So you would think the stakes are so low, but people overemphasize their own thinking in terms of the tree of life. They get so emotionally invested. You're like, look, this is the data. These are our methods. This is the tree. Go for it. We've given you everything that we have to come to the conclusions that we did. And if you ignore it, you ignore it at your own peril. And I think some of Darwin's finches has been ignored because the context of that, what people call an adaptive radiation, which I don't know about those words, but the context is in birds that have almost, not quite, almost as much variation in beaks as they do. So why? So you have to take steps back in the tree of life to figure out where genes started doing something different, where developmental biology changed. And, frankly, we haven't stepped back far enough in the tree of life for tanagers to understand all of the steps that lead up to that kind of variation. And I think that for me is the most exciting thing that the tree gives you is that framework. And we just need someone to accept that that's the tree and do that stepping back and figuring out these things.
Well, and you can go from the tips of the tree down, or you can go from the bottom of the tree up. And one of the neat things that Kevin was doing at this time was kind of the tips of the tree back. And now he and his students have gotten all this data on the overall throupid tree in a way that just reinforces the things they said in that earlier paper.
Yeah, it helps when you're on both sides of that because you fight with yourself, and that actually happens. You find things that you just don't even believe in your own mind that could be true. But it makes it a little easier to resolve.
Can you talk just a little bit on a personal level, like what it feels like to get something like that published, that discovery? I mean, you put all this time and effort. It seems like such a process to go through, and you finally get to, have everything validated. I mean, that must be a pretty exciting feeling.
Yeah, it was, it definitely was exciting. And it got a little bit of, you see it sometimes, it got out in the popular media a little bit. And we redid some of the biogeographic analyses in 2008 with some newer methods, and we got the same result. And that also got picked up by the media. So you do feel like a little validated. And then when you see the citations click up, okay, people are actually reading it and understanding. But I do feel frustrated sometimes. Like I said earlier, we still open up textbooks, or I'll hear people talking, and they just the same old stories come out about their origin that just aren't accurate. We've known now since Shannon? We published our paper in 2002, I think.
And we talked about it before that too, and a lot of people saw it before that because they made personal comments and rejected it.
Yeah.
But
so talking about a quarter of a century.
Yeah.
Kevin, shh. But for me, it was the joy of doing that with my friends. That's where.
Oh yeah, that was great. That was a good.
But you guys are walking in Darwin's footsteps.
Yeah.
Darwin didn't understand the significance of Darwin's finches. He gave them to John Gould because they were so confusing. He's like, I can't deal with this.
He did, and everybody thinks he had this eureka moment, right? But he didn't understand the finches till he understand evolution, till he understood natural selection.
Yeah, and so they're still confusing today. They still have so much to tell us. So and actually, John Gould gave it to his wife Elizabeth. So there's a women in science aspect of it that is underappreciated for sure. In terms of the paintings, most of the paintings have John Gould's name on them, but they're not exclusively his. So, complicated things get in the way of telling easy and simple and fast stories. So when it doesn't fit your preconceived ideas, you just kind of put it aside for a little while and you're like, I don't know what to do with this. I'll come back to
Yeah,
it
he didn't.
later.
Darwin didn't even label what islands his finches were from, but some of his shipmates did, so they were able to make sense of it because he couldn't see why, like, they wouldn't. He thought they'd be on all the other islands because they all had the
Wow.
same environment, and why would a creator put a different species on an island that has the same habitat? But
But there was
mockingbirds, he talks a lot about. He noticed the mockingbirds.
and it wasn't until David Lack came back and did detailed studies from an expedition in 1905 and 6, I think. And those people labeled the islands. And so it wasn't until there was a large number of specimens whose islands were labeled that you could start to understand what was happening on each of those islands. The fact that there were different size classes of beaks of birds that repeated themselves on the different islands. And so if you don't label the island, you don't know.
Well, except that we're falling into a little bit of a trap here because the trap is that the islands are actually
Oh, yes.
dictating things, where the truth of the matter is the genetic data clearly shows that these birds, particularly the seed-eating birds, are actually moving around on the islands. And as the grants have shown with spectacular data, the Galapagos are in one of the most interesting places climatically in the entire world, in the sense that every 7 years, 7 or so years, you get these El Nino events where the climate completely shifts on the island, and the plants have all evolved to deal with that. So you have big seeds some years and small seeds other years, and it oscillates back and forth over time. And so what they've shown very, very clearly on Daphne Major, this tiny island in the Galapagos, is that in those different seasons, when you've got big seeds versus small seeds, you're definitely favoring different bill sizes. But that doesn't mean that what you're seeing there in those different bill sizes represent necessarily different species depending on your concept.
There's lots of discussion of well, at least in my world, there's lots of a discussion about what a species of Darwin's finches might be and what the significance of some of that variation is. The DNA-based data that's come out shows there's, these species don't sort themselves out very well. So all of the individuals in a labeled species are not always each other's closest relatives relative to something else that's been called a species, which is usually a different beak size class. So it's really super complicated how diversification might have happened. And I think that gets back to the whole tree of life to understand why beaks are varying so much. And I think that is the fundamental thing that lets them look like all these speciation events are happening, is that the only way they could survive is to make beaks that quickly. So they make a lot of different kinds of beaks really fast. And how that relates to what a species might be or studies of speciation, to me, that's still complicated and variably known or maybe unknown from my perspective. But Kevin might think it's not as complicated as I do.
Oh, and it's very complicated, right? There's a lot of controversy about how many species there are of Galapagos finches. And it's because, like you said, the genetics don't make a nice, clean story. But I like what you said about maybe they have all these, they've evolved to be able to produce different beaks quickly because their environment's so variable. And so maybe that's something that traces back even deeper in the tree.
Yeah, that's where it always ends up to me. You got to go back through the tree of life. If you go through the pathway of hominids towards humans, you'll find out that all of the things we think of as uniquely human aren't. And they originated along the tree of life in varying ways before we get to humans. And so, humans are part of the tree of life, and so are Darwin's finches, and their historical relationships is where you have to go to find out how things got to be the way they are.
Is there any chance we could change the common name of Darwin's finches to the Burns and Hackett tanagers?
Yeah.
Let's get some t-shirts made. I'm all for that.
I don't want that.
Kevin says no. So, Shannon
No.
too.
Shannon's shaking her head.
No.
That is a political statement I'm not willing to make.
Even like changing the tanagers would feel weird to me. I mean, I think some of these words like finches or whatever, they're better thought of as like ecomorphs or something than like having to be tied to a particular clade or part of the tree. So it's better to think about them that way. So I'm fine calling them finches.
Okay.
So RJ and Amanda, one thing I would like to do, I hope Kevin feels okay with this, is if we don't have time to do it now, which I don't think we do, is the NT Tanager thing is definitely worth an episode on, just to talk about what it takes to describe a species.
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be good at some point, because there's a whole story about how that bird was described. It took like 20 years.
That's so cool.
And then it's just a weird, it's just so crazy looking. And how did this get missed? Yeah. Normally when there's a new bird species found, it's just like a little subspecies split up or something, but this is a whole new genus. It just helps also to emphasize the importance of biodiversity discovery for understanding the planet. So
and to me, it's the wildness of the earth still exists, right? We always think romantically about what it was like for Darwin to go to the Galapagos, but the reality is that happened in the last 24 years, right? Which, the earth is small, and it's not that small yet, and there's still so much left to be found.
Millions of species left to be not discovered, but described for science. I'll say that, because discovering, we don't know past people these things.
They'll always they say that birds are well known. They will always say they're the best known vertebrate group. And I like to point out now that I found a document from the American Ornithological Society back when they were the American Ornithologist Union, where they put out a future of ornithology document in the 70s. And at the time, they flat out say at the introduction to this, there are 9,000 species of birds, and we've described them all. And we're now at 11,800, which or 11,000 plus, and it's going to keep going up. And some of that is breaking up geographic variation of things that we know because they're genetically distinct and things. This NT Tanager is completely unlike that in that respect, as Kevin was saying. And so I really want to, it's a good segue from what we were just talking about with the Galapagos finches to talk about that bird.
Yeah. The way we talk about finding a tree being kind of unexpected and mind-blowing, you must think you're hallucinating, that you've accidentally taken magic mushrooms or in the field to see that bird. You must be like, what on earth is this? This cannot be the way it is.
Kevin's
of it.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Kevin.
That is so awesome.
That's so cool.
Isn't that an American goldfinch? Oh,
no. That's right.
That is so cool.
I don't know. So that's the thrill of discovering something. I mean, that's why we keep doing science, right? Is that you never know. And that's why our jobs are so great, because we get to learn things that nobody knew. Not just that we didn't know, because I do that every day, but we learn things that nobody knew. And that is so thrilling. That's best to do that with friends.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Well said.
Well, yeah, we'll definitely fit the NT Tanager in some other time.
Thanks, guys. This is great. I was pretty nervous, but I wasn't nervous once we got started, but hopefully I made sense.
Oh, you did great.
You were
Kevin.
awesome. Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to that Tanager, the yellow and black, the Kill Bill one.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, I know.
Yeah.
We have to. We can't not do that, right?
Yes.
I didn't even know until way later that it had gotten kind of that moniker, and then it's hilarious once you know. You know.
Yeah, once you see it.
Thankfully, we didn't name it that.
Yeah.
Do you know who did that first? Kevin, do you know who put that Kill Bill thing on it first?
I don't know. It may have been Dan Lane. I don't know. I mean, he's the one that had it, or Gary.
He's got a sense of humor like that. I can see Dan doing it.
My problem is I haven't seen the movie, so I don't get the role. Yeah, I've seen pictures of her in that costume, but I don't know. I guess I got to see the movie.
I love that movie. I don't want to overhype it, but
it's good.
Yeah.
Well, then we definitely should talk about that point. Yeah.
I have a quick movie note that I forgot to bring up earlier. We were watching just like last week. We're flipping through, and the movie The Usual Suspects came on, and the boat that they're on is called the Tanager. And so we were watching,
Yes.
and like that big ship is called the Tanager, and we were laughing. We're like, oh, we're talking about Tanagers next week with Kevin. So we were just having a laugh about that.
That's-
But then
I've
we were
seen that movie. I never noticed that.
Oh yeah.
Because-
We were laughing, saying that, you know, the whole movie, the premise is you don't know who this Kaiser Soze is, and then at the end, it's not who you think they were. And Amanda and I were saying the Tanagers are not who we thought they
Yes.
were at the end of this.
There we go.
Yes.
Good analogy.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's what the
sounds,
filmmakers.
that sounds like seminar material.
Yeah,
I'll have to watch that.
yeah.
Yeah, that
You don't-
needs. You need to
don't
put
see
that in one of your
Finches.
talks.
Yeah, I need to use that slide. We don't use tanagers in popular culture that much. You know, they're such a big group, bigger than hummingbirds or woodpeckers or all these other things people know really well. So
Yeah.
We
That's
need to find out who named that boat.
I know.
Right.
They're
Yeah.
ahead of their time. Yeah.
You know, they must know something about birds,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
or they could have been named after the river. You know,
Oh.
there's a river that has a close name in, you know, in Portuguese.
Okay.
oh yeah.
Well, Kevin, this has been so awesome. So thanks again for
Yeah.
joining us.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
We've-
That was
we've
awesome,
wrecked-
Kevin.
We've wrecked the way you're going to see movies now, Amanda and RJ. And
Yeah.
in fact, the
We
next
see
thing you're
birds and
going to
everything
do,
now.
Yeah.
but the next thing you're going to do is start noticing the fact that they put kookaburras and loons in almost every movie, no matter where the movie is situated. You'll yeah,
It's a
you'll
spider
notice
movie.
that.
There's a loon.
That's
We were
awesome.
watching
Yeah.
something on live TV, and it was like, depending on which camera angle they were on, you could hear it was a cardinal or something. But I was like,
Mhm.
you can only hear the cardinal when you're on this side. It was funny.
Golf is amazingly good.
Oh,
for that.
yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
At the Masters, you'll hear Carolina Wrens over and over again.
Uh-huh.
Aw.
I'm always one of the eBird things that I hear on TV from that location. But I guess
Yes.
that's not-
You're so right.
Yeah, Little House on the Prairie has a lot of California birds in it.
Oh, yeah.
Aw.
The Red Tit is a very popular soundtrack in Hollywood. They'll play the Red Tit over and over and over,
Uh-huh.
whether it's desert or whatever. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate it. If you have a question for us, you can reach us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Before we recorded this week, we were talking about Wheel of Fortune. We were still checking audio levels and plugging our mics in, but did get some funny insight on Vanna's curiosity about birds. So we'll leave you with that before we go. All right, see you all next week. We love you all. Are you ready for Ryan Seacrest to take over? Okay.
Oh, you don't? Oh, he's
Are you ready? Given that you watch it,
No, we're kind of bummed.
Fun fact, Vanna asked my student Eric about the bird-dinosaur connection during the commercial break. She wanted to know all about that. So
oh, we
Oh.
love Vanna. Smart.
We wish
Yeah.
Vanna
She
took
just-
over.
Yeah.
she just went up. Oh, she's got the 2 X chromosomes. You know, that's pretty much not allowed.
smart woman.
She went way up in my estimation, Kevin.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Good for her.
Yeah.
And I think you should use that. I think you should use that if you recorded.
Oh, I recorded that. I'll keep
I
this.
think
I'll
yeah.
keep this in.
because
Yeah, that's like a good inside tidbit about Vanna White. She's asked about the dinosaur bird connection. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, maybe we can get her on.
Write us up in the
I
mailbag.
was going to say, could be our in.